James Harrison stood in the marble foyer of what he believed was his family's superior world, looking down at his wife Elena with the kind of contempt only arrogance could produce, completely unaware his wife was wealthier than his entire family combined. "You'll never match my status," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain as he handed her the divorce papers, his mistress Vanessa smirking from the doorway of their bedroom. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the documents, but something flickered in her dark eyes, not tears, not desperation, but something far more dangerous that James was too blind to recognize. He told her she'd never match his status, throwing her modest lifestyle and quiet demeanor in her face like weapons, never questioning why a woman with her grace and education had married into his moderately successful family in the first place. His entire family combined had built their wealth over 3 generations of careful investments and strategic marriages, or so they believed. And James wore that legacy like armor as he divorced her to marry his mistress, a woman who validated his ego and hunger for public admiration. But what none of them knew, not James, not his status-obsessed mother, not even Vanessa, who was already planning her takeover of the Harrison social circle, was that Elena had been hiding something so massive it would shatter everything they thought they understood about power, wealth, and who really held the reins in this marriage. What she did next shocked everyone, sending ripples through their entire social circle and leaving James's family scrambling to understand how they'd missed the signs. But who exactly was Elena before she became Mrs. Harrison? What had she been hiding behind her soft smiles and apparent contentment with their upper-middle-class life? And why would a woman of her mysterious background choose to endure years of subtle disrespect from a family so dramatically beneath her true station? Elena Catherine Morrison had learned the art of invisibility at Wharton, where fellow students from old money families couldn't fathom that the quiet girl in vintage clothing was actually the sole heir to Morrison Global Holdings, a privately held conglomerate so discreet that its $47 billion valuation was known only to a select few in international finance circles. Her grandfather, Edmund Morrison, had built an empire spanning rare earth minerals, telecommunications infrastructure across developing nations, and a portfolio of patents that tech giants paid billions to license, all while maintaining such rigorous privacy that the family name appeared on no public rich lists, attended no gala events, and granted 0 interviews to Forbes or Fortune. She remembered the exact moment she decided to marry James Harrison 6 years ago at a charity fundraiser, watching him charm a room full of people who had no idea they were small fish in an infinitely larger pond. His confidence so complete and unthreatened because he genuinely believed his family's $40 million net worth placed them among society's elite. Something about his innocence had appealed to her, then the way he loved her without the calculating agenda she'd encountered from men who knew her real identity, the way he brought her coffee in the morning and kissed her forehead like she was precious, the way he'd proposed on a simple beach at sunset rather than orchestrating some elaborate public display. But that James had disappeared gradually, eroded by his mother Patricia's constant whispers about Elena's mysterious background, her lack of family connections at important events, her insistence on working as a mid-level consultant rather than embracing the society wife role Patricia deemed appropriate for the Harrison name. Elena had watched her husband transform from the kind man she'd married into someone who criticized her Target dresses, while his mistress wore designer labels, who questioned why. She drove a practical Honda when the Harrison garage housed 2 Mercedes, who increasingly made comments about her inability to elevate herself to his family's standards. She'd endured it silently, partly from genuine love that hoped he'd rediscover who he used to be, partly from a curiosity about how far he'd go before recognizing what he was throwing away, and partly because her grandfather's final words before his death 2 years ago still echoed in her mind. "Elena, you'll know when you've found something real versus something built on shallow ground, and when you discover which you have, act accordingly." The divorce papers James thrust at her on this cold November morning represented his final transformation into someone unrecognizable. And as Elena sat in the breakfast nook of their modest four-bedroom house in suburban Connecticut, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been avoiding for 2 years. This marriage had become a performance she no longer needed to continue. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard Chen, the managing director of Morrison Global Holdings, who'd served her family for 30 years. "Elena, the quarterly board meeting is tomorrow. Will you be attending, or shall I continue with proxy authority?" She'd been avoiding the office, avoiding her inheritance, avoiding the weight of her real life, because some part of her had still been clinging to the fantasy that love could exist separate from wealth and status. James had just incinerated that fantasy by choosing Vanessa Chen, no relation to Richard, just an ambitious marketing director at his commercial real estate firm. A woman whose appeal seemed entirely based on her willingness to worship James's mediocre accomplishments and laugh at his recycled jokes. Elena's fingers moved across her phone screen with sudden clarity, typing a response to Richard that would set everything in motion. "I'll attend in person. It's time I took my proper seat. Also, please have prepare a complete financial disclosure package. I believe my marriage is about to require some transparency." She looked around the kitchen she'd painted herself in cheerful yellow, at the herb garden she'd nurtured on the windowsill, at the framed photos showing a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else, and felt the strange liberation that comes from finally stopping pretending. James had given her an unexpected gift with his cruelty this morning. He'd freed her from the obligation of protecting his ego, from the exhausting work of making herself smaller so he could feel larger, from the guilt she'd have felt leaving him for no reason other than his inadequacy. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled her from her thoughts, and she glanced up to see James descending with a leather overnight bag. His expression a mixture of defiance and something that might have been uncertainty if she looked closely enough. "I'll be staying at Vanessa's until we sort out the details," he announced, his tone attempting authority but landing somewhere closer to defensive. "My lawyer will contact you next week about asset division. I'm being generous, Elena. You'll get your fair share even though you brought nothing substantial to this marriage." Elena felt a smile touch her lips. Not bitter but genuinely amused, and she watched confusion flicker across James's face at her unexpected reaction. "Of course, James, I'm sure your lawyer will be very thorough about identifying and dividing all marital assets," she replied, her voice maintaining the gentle quality he'd grown accustomed to dismissing as weakness. He stared at her for a moment, perhaps expecting tears or pleas or anger, and when none materialized, he simply shook his head and walked out the front door, leaving her sitting in the morning sunlight streaming through windows of a house that had never really been their home, just a stage where she'd performed a role that no longer fit. As his car pulled out of the driveway, Elena opened her laptop and began composing an email to her attorneys at Morrison & Strauss, the discreet firm that had served her family for 3 generations and whose senior partners had watched her grow from a child into the woman now claiming her inheritance. "Dear Mitchell," she wrote to Mitchell Strauss himself, "please prepare to represent me in a divorce proceeding. The marriage is irretrievably broken, and I'd like to ensure all assets, including those held in trust and private holdings, are properly disclosed according to Connecticut law. I believe my husband is currently under the impression that I'm an ordinary woman of modest means. I'd like to correct this misunderstanding through proper legal channels before his attorneys make assumptions that could prove embarrassing for their client." She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, then added one final line. "Also, please prepare documentation regarding Morrison Global Holdings' interest in acquiring Harrison commercial properties. I believe they've been seeking capital partners for their expansion plans. I'd like to review their financials ahead of our board meeting tomorrow." She pressed send and closed the laptop, feeling the strange vertigo that comes from stepping out of one life and back into another. From removing a mask worn so long, it had started to feel like her actual face. The Morrison Global Holdings headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a discreet building in downtown Manhattan that most people passed without noticing, its entrance marked only by a small brass plaque that revealed nothing about the empire operating above. Elena stepped out of the private elevator into the executive suite 48 hours after James had walked out, her appearance transformed from the casual consultant he'd known into something that turned heads. As she moved through hallways lined with original Rothkos and hoppers her grandfather had collected over 60 years of strategic acquisitions. She wore a tailored Loro Piana suit in charcoal gray, Manolo Blahnik heels that added 3 inches to her height, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd been trained from childhood to command rooms full of powerful people. Her transformation so complete that even longtime employees did double takes before recognition dawned in their eyes. Richard Chen met her outside the boardroom, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since her grandfather's funeral, relief and approval mixing in his expression as he took in her presence. "Welcome back, Miss Morrison. The board has been eager for your direct involvement," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed warmth that made her remember him teaching her chess strategy at age 10, explaining that business was ultimately about seeing 7 moves ahead while making your opponent believe you were only planning 2. The boardroom held 12 individuals who collectively managed assets exceeding the GDP of several small nations. Their expertise spanning industries from biotechnology to satellite communications, and every one of them rose as Elena entered, showing the respect her grandfather had commanded, and that she was now claiming as his successor. She took her seat at the head of the table, Edmund Morrison's chair, now hers, and felt the weight of legacy settle onto her shoulders like a familiar coat she'd temporarily forgotten she owned. "Thank you all for your patience during my extended absence," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying none of the softness James had grown accustomed to dismissing. "I needed time to understand certain things about loyalty, value, and the difference between genuine partnership and parasitic relationships. That education is now complete, and I'm here to fully assume my responsibilities to this company and to my grandfather's vision." The meeting covered quarterly earnings that exceeded projections by 17%, discussed expansion opportunities in African telecommunications markets, and reviewed patent licensing agreements that would generate another $800 million in annual revenue. All topics Elena engaged with sharp questions that demonstrated she'd been studying the business far more intently than her absence from these rooms might have suggested. When the formal agenda concluded, she leaned forward slightly, her fingers steepled on the mahogany table, and introduced the topic that had been simmering in her mind since sending that email to Mitchell Strauss. "I'd like to discuss a potential acquisition in the Connecticut commercial real estate market," she said, watching Richard's eyebrows rise with interest. "Harrison Commercial Properties, they're a second-generation firm currently managing about $180 million in assets, primarily retail and office space in Hartford and New Haven. They've been seeking capital partners for a planned expansion into Massachusetts markets. I'd like us to review their financials and determine if they'd make a suitable addition to our portfolio." The silence that followed carried weight as board members exchanged glances, and Elena knew they were wondering about her motivations, calculating whether this represented sound business strategy or personal entanglement. But Richard spoke before anyone else could. "I'm familiar with Harrison Commercial, decent fundamentals but over-leveraged given current market conditions. They've approached several equity firms, but their valuation expectations are unrealistic. If we're interested, we'd be in a strong negotiating position." He paused, then added carefully, "Though I should mention that their CEO, James Harrison Jr., happens to share a surname with you. Is this a conflict of interest we should be aware of?" Elena allowed a thin smile to cross her lips, appreciating Richard's discretion in phrasing it as a question rather than an assumption. "James Harrison Jr. is currently my husband, though divorce proceedings will be filed this week. I don't believe that creates a conflict. If anything, it provides us with unique insight into the company's operations and management philosophy. Mr. Harrison recently made clear his assessment that I lack the resources or status to match his family's achievements. I thought it might be educational for him to understand exactly what resources I do have access to, should we choose to exercise them." The room remained silent for another beat before Patricia Chen, The board's lead counsel, and no relation to either Richard or Vanessa, spoke with dry amusement coloring her professional tone. So to be clear, you're proposing we potentially acquire your husband's family business as he's divorcing you under the mistaken impression that you're a woman of modest means? That's certainly a novel approach to marital dissolution. Elena met Patricia's gaze directly, seeing the sharp intelligence behind the way. Older woman's glasses, and nodded slowly. I'm proposing we evaluate a company that might benefit from Morrison Global's capital and expertise, while simultaneously correcting a misunderstanding that's been allowed to persist too long. My husband has spent 6 years believing he married beneath his station. I think it's time for some clarity about relative positions, don't you? The smile that crossed Patricia Chen's face was predatory in its appreciation for the chess move Elena was proposing, and she glanced at the financial officers present before responding. I'll have our M&A team pull together a complete analysis of Harrison Commercial by end of week. If the fundamentals support an acquisition or significant investment position, we can prepare a preliminary offer. I assume you'd like this handled with appropriate discretion until your personal situation is legally resolved? Elena shook her head, her decision crystallizing in real time as she understood exactly what move came next in this particular game. Actually, I'd like this handled with maximum transparency and minimum discretion. When we approach Harrison Commercial with our offer, I want James Harrison Jr. to understand exactly who's making it. I want him in the room when Morrison Global Holdings presents its terms. I want him to see my name on the paperwork as the principal decision maker and majority shareholder. I spent 6 years being invisible in my own marriage, Patricia. I'm done with invisibility. The approval that rippled around the table was palpable, and Elena felt something unlock in her chest, not revenge exactly, but the fierce satisfaction of finally allowing herself to be fully seen after years of carefully maintained camouflage. She'd hidden herself to preserve a marriage that James had dismantled anyway, had made herself small to protect his ego, that he'd ultimately used as a weapon against her. And now she was done with the exhausting work of diminishment. Richard cleared his throat, drawing her attention back to practical matters with the gentle efficiency he'd always employed when she got too caught up in abstract principles. There's another element to consider, Elena. When Harrison Commercial's financial situation becomes clear, and when your identity as Morrison Global's principal becomes public, there will be significant media interest. Your grandfather went to extraordinary lengths to keep the family private. Are you prepared for that level of exposure? It was a fair question, and Elena took a moment to genuinely consider it, weighing her grandfather's fierce protection of their privacy against her own need to finally stop hiding from her own life. Grandfather kept us private because he believed wealth made us targets, and that obscurity was protection, she said slowly, thinking through the implications as she spoke. But I've learned that making yourself invisible doesn't protect you from predators. Richard, it just makes it easier for them to pretend you don't exist when it suits their purposes. James could treat me as disposable because he genuinely believed I was nobody. Maybe it's time the world knows that Morrison Global Holdings has a new generation at the helm and that we're not planning to remain in the shadows anymore. The envelope arrived at Harrison Commercial Properties on a Tuesday morning, delivered by special courier to James Harrison Jr.'s corner office with views of Hartford's modest skyline, and his assistant Karen noted that it came from Morrison and Strauss, a law firm whose name she didn't recognize despite 20 years in Connecticut legal circles. James accepted the package with mild curiosity, expecting perhaps something related to Elena's divorce response, maybe a request for mediation, or a list of modest demands he could easily accommodate from his position of superior resources and status. He was mid-sip of his overpriced artisanal coffee when he opened the Morrison and Strauss letter and began reading words that didn't immediately make sense, his brain refusing to process the legal language that described Morrison Global Holdings' interest in acquiring a controlling stake in Harrison Commercial Properties, and referenced preliminary valuations based on their most recent financial disclosures. The coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth as he read further, his eyes catching on phrases like substantial capital infusion and strategic restructuring under new management. And most confusingly, a mention of Miss Elena Morrison's direct involvement in acquisition discussions. James set down his coffee with a sharp click against his mahogany desk, the expensive desk he'd purchased to project success, to impress clients with Harrison Commercial's stability and growth, and read the letter again more carefully, looking for the connection his mind was refusing to make. Elena Morrison. His wife was Elena Harrison, had been Elena Collins before their marriage, had never mentioned any connection to Morrison, anything during 6 years of what he'd believed was complete transparency about their backgrounds and families. He buzzed his assistant with more sharpness than intended. "Karen, get me everything you can find on Morrison Global Holdings. Company profile, leadership, financial information, whatever's publicly available. And find out why a company I've never heard of is sending me acquisition offers." He listened to her, acknowledged the request, then sat back in his leather chair, staring at the letter that had suddenly transformed from mundane business correspondence into something that made his stomach tighten with undefined anxiety. His phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "Lunch at 1? Want to discuss venue options for the engagement party." He stared at the message, at the casual presumption that they were already planning celebrations, at the emoji that suddenly seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the strange unease creeping up his spine, and didn't respond. 20 minutes later, Karen knocked and entered with a tablet and printed materials, her expression troubled in a way that made James's unease spike into something approaching dread. "Mr. Harrison, I found some information about Morrison Global Holdings, but I think there might be an error in these reports," she began, her usual efficiency faltering as she clearly struggled with how to present what she'd discovered. "The company is privately held, so detailed financials aren't public, but according to multiple sources in international business publications, they're valued somewhere between $45 and $50 billion. They have holdings in rare earth mining, telecommunications infrastructure, technology patents, and apparently a significant private equity division." James took the tablet from her with hands that had gone slightly numb, scrolling through articles from obscure industry publications that detailed Morrison Global's quiet dominance in sectors he barely understood. Seeing references to telecommunications projects across Africa and Southeast Asia, to patent portfolios that tech giants relied on, to a level of wealth and power so far above his family's modest success that it existed in a completely different atmosphere. "This can't be right," he muttered, more to himself than Karen. "Why would a company like this be interested in Harrison Commercial? We're not operating at this level." Karen shifted uncomfortably, then touched the screen to bring up a different article. This one, from a discreet wealth management publication that James had never encountered. "That's not the confusing part, Mr. Harrison. Look at this piece from last year about succession planning and family-held conglomerates. It mentions Morrison Global Holdings specifically." James read the paragraph Karen had highlighted, his eyes catching on words that seemed to rearrange reality as he understood it. Morrison Global Holdings, the discreet empire built by the late Edmund Morrison, has reportedly transferred control to his sole heir and granddaughter, Elena Catherine Morrison, who assumed full authority following his death in 2023. The younger Morrison, educated at Wharton and previously maintaining an extremely low public profile, now serves as the company's principal decision-maker and majority shareholder, continuing her grandfather's tradition of shunning publicity while wielding considerable influence across multiple industries. James read the paragraph 3 times, each pass failing to dislodge the information that had lodged in his brain like a splinter. Elena Catherine Morrison. His wife was Elena Catherine. She'd kept her middle name after their marriage at her insistence, a detail he'd found charmingly old-fashioned. Elena Catherine Morrison, the sole heir to a $50 billion empire. The woman he'd divorced 3 days ago because she didn't match his status. His phone rang, the display showing Mitchell Strauss himself, and James answered with a throat gone suddenly dry. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for taking my call. I'm following up on the letter my firm sent regarding Morrison Global Holdings' interest in your company The attorney's voice was professionally cordial, but carried an edge that suggested he was delivering information rather than engaging in negotiation. Miss Morrison has asked me to arrange a meeting between Morrison Global's acquisition team and Harrison Commercial's leadership to discuss terms in detail. Would Thursday at 2 p.m. work for you and your father? We can meet at Morrison Global's Manhattan offices, or if you prefer, we can arrange something in Hartford. James's mind raced, trying to organize thoughts that kept fragmenting as soon as he grasped them. Mr. Strauss, before we discuss meetings, I need to understand something. The Elena Morrison mentioned in your letter, is that Elena Catherine Morrison? And if so, what's her relationship to Elena Harrison? Because he stopped, unable to complete the sentence, because completing it meant acknowledging something too massive to be real. Mitchell Strauss's pause carried weight that confirmed everything before he spoke. Mr. Harrison, I'm not at liberty to discuss Miss Morrison's personal relationships. However, I can confirm that Elena Catherine Morrison is the principal of Morrison Global Holdings and the individual driving interest in your company's acquisition. If you have questions about her identity or background, I'd suggest addressing those with her directly. Now, regarding Thursday's meeting. But James had stopped listening, his attention caught by movement outside his office window where, impossibly, Elena was walking through Harrison Commercial's lobby, moving past the receptionist with a confidence he'd never seen her exhibit, wearing clothes he'd never seen her own, carrying herself like someone who owned whatever space she occupied, rather than someone grateful for permission to exist in it. She was accompanied by two individuals in expensive suits, and they were being directed toward the conference room by his father's assistant, Margaret, who looked simultaneously confused and impressed in a way that made James understand his world was about to crack open. He ended the call with Mitchell Strauss without courtesy, simply pressing the button to disconnect, and stood on legs that felt uncertain beneath him, watching through his office window as Elena settled into a chair in the conference room, visible through interior glass walls. As she smiled at something one of her companions said, as his father, James Harrison Sr., entered and stopped short upon seeing her, his confusion evident even from this distance. James moved toward his office door with the strange dissociation that accompanies moments when reality shifts its fundamental structure, when everything you believed about the world reorganizes into a pattern you never imagined possible, and he walked down the hallway toward the conference room where his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, was apparently conducting a business meeting in his family's company headquarters. He paused outside the conference room door, his hand on the handle, and through the glass he could see Elena's face in profile, see the woman he'd shared a bed with for 6 years, see a stranger who wore her features but inhabited them with an authority and power he'd never witnessed before. And he understood, with sudden, devastating clarity, that he'd never actually known his wife at all. He opened the door, and every head turned toward him, but his eyes locked on Elena's, searching for the soft, accommodating woman he'd grown accustomed to dismissing, finding instead someone who met his gaze with cool assessment that held no anger, no hurt, just a kind of clinical interest in observing his reaction. "James," she said, her voice carrying that same unfamiliar authority. "How convenient. Your father and I were just discussing Morrison Global Holdings' interest in acquiring Harrison Commercial Properties. I don't believe you've met Richard Chen, our managing director, or Patricia Chen, our lead counsel. Gentlemen, Patricia, this is James Harrison Jr., the company's COO and my soon-to-be former husband." The room seemed to tilt slightly, and James gripped the back of a chair to steady himself, his father staring at him with an expression that demanded explanation for why his daughter-in-law was apparently representing a company whose resources dwarfed everything the Harrison family had built across 3 generations. "Elena, what is this?" James managed, his voice coming out rough and uncertain. "What are you talking about? Morrison Global Holdings? Why are you—" He stopped, unable to formulate coherent questions because he didn't know which thread to pull first in the tangle of confusion, overwhelming his capacity to process information. Elena tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same clinical interest, and, when she spoke, her tone was almost gentle, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a struggling student. I'm here representing my company, James. Morrison Global Holdings has been evaluating expansion opportunities in Connecticut commercial real estate, and your family's business fits our criteria. We're prepared to offer $340 million for an 80% controlling stake, which based on current market conditions and your debt obligations, represents a very fair valuation. Your family would retain 20% equity and could remain in operational management roles, though strategic direction would transfer to Morrison Global's real estate division. We can discuss terms in detail, but I wanted to handle this personally given my familiarity with the company's strengths and challenges. She paused, then added with that same gentle tone that somehow made it worse. Though I should clarify, when I say my company, I mean exactly that. I'm the sole owner and principal, decision maker, at Morrison Global Holdings. My grandfather founded it 60 years ago, and I inherited full control when he passed away 2 years ago. The meeting lasted 90 minutes that felt like being underwater, James listening through layers of distortion as Elena and her team methodically outlined Morrison Global Holdings' offer, as they demonstrated intimate knowledge of Harrison Commercial's financial challenges and growth limitations, as his father's face cycled through confusion to understanding, to something approaching horror as the implications crystallized. Patricia Chen presented the acquisition terms with ruthless efficiency, highlighting how Morrison Global's capital would eliminate the debt burden that had been strangling Harrison Commercial's expansion plans, how their infrastructure and expertise would open markets the Harrisons couldn't access independently, how the $68 million that would go directly to the Harrison family represented more liquidity than they'd ever held in their lives. Of course, we understand this is a significant decision requiring careful consideration, Patricia concluded, her sharp eyes moving between James Sr. and James Jr. with analytical precision. We're prepared to give you 1 week to review the terms with your attorneys and financial advisors. Miss Morrison wanted to present this personally as a courtesy, given her connection to your family. But please understand that Morrison Global has other opportunities we're evaluating in this market. We need a decision within 7 days, or we'll redirect our resources elsewhere. James Sr. spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice carrying the careful control of someone fighting to maintain dignity while his world collapsed. Elena, I don't understand. You've been married to my son for 6 years. You never mentioned, we had no idea that you. He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence, and Elena's expression softened slightly. Genuine regret, flickering across features that had maintained professional neutrality throughout the presentation. I know, James, she said, using his first name in a way she never had before, addressing him as an equal rather than as her father-in-law. I kept my identity private for reasons that made sense at the time. I wanted a normal life, a normal marriage, without the complications that come with significant wealth. I wanted to be loved for who I was rather than what I could provide. Your son gave me that initially, and I'm grateful for those early years. But circumstances change, and I'm no longer willing to be invisible in my own life. This business proposal stands separate from my personal history with your family. Morrison Global would be interested in Harrison Commercial regardless of my marriage to your son. But I won't pretend that watching you all struggle financially while believing yourselves superior to me hasn't added a certain irony to this situation. James Jr. finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate in a way that made him hate himself. Elena, wait, this is insane. You're a consultant. You work from home in sweatpants. You drive a Honda. You shop at Target. You can't possibly be. This doesn't make any sense. The words tumbled out, chaotic and accusing, revealing his panic. And he watched something shift in Elena's expression, not anger exactly, but a kind of tired disappointment that cut deeper than rage would have. I'm a consultant because I chose to work in a field I find intellectually engaging without trading on my family name, she replied, her voice maintaining that infuriating calm. I drove a Honda and wore Target clothes because I wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. I was comfortable being myself, James. The real question is, Why you assumed that modest choices meant modest resources. Why you never questioned where I went when I took work trips to Manhattan. Why you never wondered how someone with my education ended up in a consulting job that couldn't possibly pay for the lifestyle we were living even with your contribution. The truth of her words hit him like cold water, forcing him to replay 6 years of marriage through a new lens, seeing for the first time the inconsistencies he'd never questioned. Her first-class flight upgrades she'd explained as frequent flyer perks, her casual mentions of childhood travel to countries he'd never visited, her complete lack of concern about money even in moments when he'd worried about major expenses, her inexplicable absences that she'd attributed to consulting projects but that had never generated visible income. Why? He asked, the single word carrying everything he couldn't articulate. Why hide? Why reveal now? Why let him believe a lie for years? Why marry him at all if she existed in a stratosphere so far above his actual station? Elena stood, smoothing her suit with hands that were steady, despite the emotional weight of the moment, and looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been the exhausted recognition that comes from finally being seen after years of invisibility. I hid because I wanted to know what it felt like to be ordinary, James. And I'm revealing myself now because you've made it impossible to continue pretending that our marriage was built on anything real. You divorced me because I didn't match your status. Those were your exact words. You told me I'd never be enough for your family, that I was embarrassingly beneath you, that Vanessa represented the kind of woman a Harrison man deserved. So I'm showing you exactly what you threw away when you made those assessments. Morrison Global Holdings isn't just interested in Harrison Commercial as an investment opportunity. We're interested because your company is struggling, over-leveraged, and vulnerable. And now you have to decide whether to accept help from the woman you deemed inadequate or to watch your family's legacy crumble because your pride won't let you acknowledge how catastrophically wrong you were about who held the power in our relationship. She gathered her materials, Richard and Patricia rising with her in synchronized efficiency, and moved toward the conference room door, pausing with her hand on the handle to deliver one final observation. Your mother, Patricia, spent 6 years making subtle comments about my lack of family connections, about my inability to move in proper society, about how I was failing to elevate myself to Harrison standards. I'd like you to deliver a message to her. The Morrison family doesn't attend galas or appear on rich lists because we're busy actually running the industries that people at galas like to talk about. We don't need to perform wealth, we are wealth. And I'm done apologizing for refusing to perform for an audience that couldn't recognize substance if it was standing in front of them in a Target dress. Elena walked out of the conference room, her team following with the disciplined precision of people accustomed to executing their principals' decisions, and James stood frozen, watching her disappear through Harrison Commercial's lobby, past the receptionist who stared with open curiosity, out the front doors toward a black car, with a driver that James suddenly recognized as having dropped Elena off numerous times over the years, details clicking into place like puzzle pieces, forming a picture he'd been too arrogant to see. His father sank into a conference room chair, his face pale and drawn in a way that aged him a decade in moments, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of someone recognizing catastrophic failure. Jesus Christ, James. What did you do? What the hell did you do? James wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd had no idea, that Elena had lied by omission, that none of this was his fault, but the words died in his throat because even as he tried to construct the defense, he knew it was worthless. He'd divorced Elena because he believed she was beneath him, because Vanessa's constant validation felt better than Elena's quiet competence, because his mother had convinced him that his wife's lack of flashiness indicated lack of substance. And he'd never questioned those assumptions, because questioning would have required acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the most important person in the room. His phone buzzed with another text from Vanessa, this one more insistent. James? You're being weird. Everything okay? Call me. He stared at the message. At this woman he'd chosen over Elena, at this person who validated his ego and ambitions and had seemed like such an upgrade 3 months ago when their affair had started, and felt something like nausea rise in his throat. Vanessa drove a leased BMW that strained her budget, wore designer labels purchased on credit cards, performed success rather than embodying it, and he'd thought she represented the life he deserved, the partner appropriate for a man of his status and ambition. Meanwhile, Elena had been sitting across the breakfast table from him for 6 years, commanding a $47 billion empire between bites of cereal, attending board meetings that shaped international markets, while he criticized her sweatpants. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't currently destroying everything he'd believed about his life and identity. The following Thursday morning, James sat in the reception area of Morrison Global Holdings Manhattan headquarters, his father beside him, rigid with tension, both of them waiting for a meeting neither wanted but couldn't afford to refuse. They'd spent 5 days with their attorneys reviewing Morrison Global's offer, learning exactly how precarious Harrison Commercial's financial position actually was, understanding with growing horror that Elena's company represented not just an opportunity, but probably their only viable option for avoiding bankruptcy within 18 months given current market conditions and their debt obligations. The reception area itself communicated power through understatement original artwork that museums would kill to acquire hanging casually on walls, furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a view of Manhattan that reminded visitors they were in the presence of people who operated at stratospheric levels. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Morrison is ready for you," a polished assistant announced, and they followed her through hallways that felt like walking through a museum of wealth so extreme it became abstract, until they entered a boardroom where Elena sat at the head of a table surrounded by people whose competence was visible in their posture and expressions. The meeting was professional, efficient, and utterly devastating to James's remaining ego as Elena and her team walked through acquisition terms with the casual expertise of people who'd executed similar deals hundreds of times, as they outlined exactly how Morrison Global would restructure Harrison Commercial to maximize efficiency and profitability. As they made clear that while the Harrison family would retain nominal involvement, actual control would transfer completely. His father asked occasional questions in a voice that had lost its usual authority, and James sat largely silent, unable to contribute meaningfully to negotiations happening at a level of sophistication he'd never operated at, watching Elena command the room with an ease that made him realize she'd been performing deference for 6 years and how exhausting that performance must have been. "We're prepared to finalize this transaction by end of month if you're ready to proceed," Patricia Chen concluded after 90 minutes of excruciating detail. "I'll need signed letters of intent from both James Sr. and James Jr. as principal stakeholders, plus approval from your board of directors. But given your current situation, I don't anticipate significant objections." James Sr. cleared his throat, struggling to maintain dignity in a situation that had stripped away any pretense of equality between the Harrisons and the Morrisons. "Elena, I need to ask, why? Why are you doing this? Is this punishment for how my son treated you? Because if that's the motivation, I want you to know that James made his own choices but Elena cut him off with a raised hand, her expression not unkind but absolutely firm in a way that communicated she wouldn't tolerate deflection. "This is business, James. Morrison Global identified Harrison Commercial as a solid opportunity that fits our expansion strategy. Yes, there's personal history that adds complexity, but I wouldn't risk $340 million of company capital on revenge. Your business has good fundamentals and potential. It just needs resources and expertise you don't have access to. I'm offering you both survival and prosperity. What you choose to do with that offer is entirely your decision, but don't mistake it for charity or punishment. It's simply business." She stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion, and extended her hand to James Sr., who shook it with the mechanical movement of someone in shock. "You'll have our decision by Friday," he managed, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Thank you for the consideration." Elena nodded, then turned to James Jr., her expression shifting into something more personal, more complicated, as she looked at the man she'd shared a life with for 6 years. "James, "Can I have a moment alone with you before you go?" It wasn't really a question, and his father glanced at him with concern before gathering materials and following the Morrison Global team out of the boardroom, leaving James and Elena facing each other across the polished table where she'd just casually dismantled his family's independence. "I don't expect you to understand why I hid my identity," she began, her voice losing some of its boardroom precision, becoming more human. "And I don't need you to forgive me for the deception, but I want you to understand something. When I married you, I genuinely believed we could build something real together. I loved who you were before your mother's opinions, and Vanessa's validation convinced you that I wasn't enough. I loved the man who brought me coffee and kissed my forehead and proposed on a beach at sunset. That man disappeared, James, and maybe that's partially my fault for not being honest about who I was, but it's mostly your fault for deciding that a woman in Target clothes couldn't possibly have value." James felt tears burning behind his eyes, unwelcome and humiliating, as he grasped for words that might undo the catastrophic choices he'd made. "Elena, I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I was an idiot. I let my mother poison everything. And Vanessa she made me feel important in a way that I realize now was completely hollow. But if I'd known who you really were, I would never have," she laughed, cutting him off. But it wasn't a cruel sound, just tired and sad and final, in a way that made him understand nothing he said would change the trajectory they were on. "Exactly, James. If you'd known who I really was, if you'd known about the money and the power, you would have treated me completely differently, which is precisely why I hid it in the first place. I wanted to be loved for Elena, not for Morrison Global Holdings. And for a while, you did love Elena, but then you decided Elena wasn't impressive enough, wasn't valuable enough, wasn't worthy of being a Harrison wife. So now you get to live with the consequences of that assessment." She moved toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor with finality, then paused and looked back at him with something like compassion in her dark eyes. "For what it's worth, I hope you figure out who you actually are, beyond your mother's expectations and Vanessa's validation. There was a good man in there once. I married him. Maybe he's still somewhere inside you, buried under all the insecurity and performance. If you find him again, I think he'd be horrified by the man you've become." And then she was gone, leaving James standing alone in a boardroom that cost more than his house, surrounded by artwork worth millions, facing the reality that he'd thrown away something irreplaceable because he'd been too arrogant to recognize its value. His phone buzzed with another message from Vanessa, something about meeting her parents and planning their future, and he stared at it with growing horror, understanding that he'd traded a partner of genuine substance for a performance of the life he'd thought he deserved, and that he'd be living with that choice for the rest of his life. The irony was crushing. He'd divorced Elena because she'd never match his status, and it turned out his entire family combined couldn't match a fraction of hers, and now he got to watch her acquire his family's legacy with pocket change, while he explained to Vanessa why their engagement might need to wait because his financial situation had just become catastrophically complicated. In the reception area, his father was pale and silent, and they rode the elevator down 48 floors without speaking, both men processing the thorough dismantling of every assumption they'd held about status, power, and their place in the hierarchy of wealth. On the street, surrounded by Manhattan's teeming crowds, James Sr. finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that comes too late to matter. "Your mother is going to have questions about how we missed this, about how we treated Edmund Morrison's granddaughter like she was fortunate to marry into our family, about how we didn't recognize that Elena's quiet confidence wasn't humility, it was the security of someone who had nothing to prove to people operating at our level." He paused, then added with something like, "Wonder. She was slumming, James. The entire time we thought we were being generous by accepting her, she was slumming, and we were too stupid and too arrogant to see it." James had no response because there was no response adequate to the magnitude of their failure, so they stood on a Manhattan sidewalk, While around them, people rushed past pursuing ambitions and climbing hierarchies. While 48 floors above them, Elena Catherine Morrison commanded an empire and prepared to absorb his family's business like it was just another line item on a quarterly acquisition report. And he understood with perfect clarity that he'd just learned the most expensive lesson of his life about the difference between appearing powerful and actually being powerful, between performing status and embodying it, between a woman worth divorcing and a woman whose entire net worth exceeded his family's combined assets by a factor that made the comparison meaningless.